to the Banking Royal Commission.
With former High Court Judge, the Honourable Kenneth Hayne, ACQC, as Royal Commissioner. As the letters patent make clear, the Royal Commission is to report on both misconduct and conduct which falls short of community standards and expectations, and to identify the causes of that conduct. The Commissioner's role, and that of the Commission, is to exercise executive, not judicial power. The Commissioner does not determine disputes, award damages or other relief, or decide whether there has been misconduct. They are roles for a court. The government would like to thank the Commissioner and his team for their outstanding work to date, and we look forward to receiving their final report next year. The interim report delivered today to the Governor-General shines a very bright light on the poor behaviour of our financial sector. Banks and other financial institutions have put profits before people. I repeat that. Banks and other financial institutions have put profits before people. Greed has been the motive, as short-term profits have been pursued at the expense of basic standards of honesty. Too often, simply selling products and services have become the sole focus of attention. The culture and the conduct of the banks was, in the words of the Commissioner, driven by and reflected in their remuneration practices and policies. This was coupled with deficiencies in governance and risk management. As a result, almost every piece of conduct identified and criticised in this report can be connected directly to some monetary benefit from engaging in the conduct. In the end, rules, systems, processes and practices are necessary, but having the right culture and performance depends, in the Commissioner's words, upon people applying the right standards and doing their job properly. This interim report also makes clear that while behaviour was poor, misconduct, when revealed, quote, either went unpunished or the consequences did not meet the seriousness of what has been done. The Commissioner makes a series of significant observations with respect to the effectiveness and the ability of regulators to detect, monitor and enforce compliance with the law. ASIC, the Commissioner points out, rarely went to court to seek public denunciation of and punishment for misconduct. Indeed, in his words, little happened beyond an apology from the entity, a drawn-out remediation, an infringement notice or an enforceable undertaking that acknowledged no more than ASIC had reasonable concerns about the entity's conduct. Significantly, the Commissioner observed infringement notices imposed penalties that were immaterial for the large banks. Again, in his words, too often entities had been treated in ways that would allow them to think that they, not ASIC, not the Parliament, not the courts, will decide when and how the law will be obeyed or the consequence of the breach remedied. I want to repeat that. Too often, entities have been treated in ways that would allow them to think that they, not ASIC, not the Parliament, not the courts, will decide when and how the law will be obeyed or the consequences of the breach remedied. This is clearly unacceptable and cannot continue. Finally, the Commissioner asked the question, what can be done to prevent the conduct happening again? In doing so, he makes the telling observation that much more often than not, the conduct now condemned was contrary to the law. This does raise the question whether new laws are required or whether existing laws simply need to be better enforced. He also asks the question, should the existing law be simplified rather than adding an extra layer of legal complexity to an already complex regulatory regime? This interim report is a frank and scathing assessment of the culture, conduct and compliance of our financial system. Australians expect and deserve better. The government thanks the Commissioner for his interim report. We look forward to receiving his final report. And we will take the action necessary to restore the public's confidence and trust in our financial system, which is a vitally important part of the Australian economy. Are there any questions? Sure.
You mentioned right at the beginning that the financial sector is the largest sector in the whole economy, and I'm wondering if, on the basis of what we've heard here and in other inquiries, that is actually appropriate for an economy, whether you want the financial system to be the largest system in the economy and the banks, as you seem to have described, to be almost not amenable to tough regulation by government regulators.
Well, it's vitally important to have a healthy, robust, strong financial system, and I do believe Australia has a very strong financial system. In fact, one of the reasons why we came through the global financial crisis, in addition to John Howard and Peter Costello leaving a lot of money in the bank to be able to be spent through the cycle, was that we had a sound financial system that didn't have some of the challenges we saw, for example, in the United States with the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loans. That being said, Australians expect their superannuation services, their insurance services, their banking services, their financial advice to be delivered in a way that puts their interests first, that the consumer comes first, second and third. In fact, these financial entities have an obligation under their licence to act honestly, fairly and efficiently.
Do you think there was a mismatch between the resources of the regulator and the entities that they were regulating?
That's not clear from this report. In fact, what is clear from this report is that too often the regulator would seek a negotiated outcome as opposed to taking the next step, which would be to litigate and make these entities face court.
They don't have a great, the regulators don't have a great track record in this country winning in court against these entities, do they? So can that behaviour perhaps be in part explained by the fact that at least by getting an undertaking they were altering the behaviour? Do you think, is there historically a case that emerges here that we have under
That is not clear from the report. In fact, the report talks about the need for the regulator to take these forms of action, and that too often they were seeking merely just to negotiate with these parties. Well, I think it was a strategy that they had, which saw the regulator working too closely with the sector that they were regulating. We have increased the resources by more than $70 million to ASIC, and as you know, we have put in place Daniel Crennan QC to be an effective enforcer of compliance. But what this report does go to with ASIC is a culture among the regulators which did not produce the best possible outcomes for consumers. I do point out that we have a new head of ASIC in James Shipton, and he is already undertaking a review led by Daniel Crennan to work out what is the best strategy around enforcement and compliance. Sorry.
Was that $70 million? 46 million, I think, is earmarked for litigation or enforcement. That's not a lot. Maybe 2-3 big litigations would. So, are you going to look at those budgetary limitations for ASIC and for the Commonwealth prosecutor?
Look, we continue to work very closely with ASIC, and if ASIC puts the case that they do need more resources, then obviously that will get a favourable hearing from the government. The point of the Commissioner's findings here goes to the culture of negotiation as opposed to litigation or taking stronger action. That often the penalties that were meted out to the banks were, in his words, immaterial to their balance sheets. So there is a much deeper systemic question here, which is within our regulators, how do they approach compliance? Now, another important point from the Commissioner's report is he said whatever the criticisms are of the regulator, we should remember actually who perpetrated the wrong conduct. And that was the financial institutions themselves. So they are ultimately, and the individuals involved, they are ultimately the ones who must be held accountable and responsible for their action. The regulators need to enforce the laws that they have at their disposal, impose the penalties that are available to them, and in doing so, we're more likely to see a culture of compliance than what we've seen to date.
The government has previously called ASIC the tough cop on the beat. Do you now admit that choice of phrasing is wrong?
No, the ASIC is actually the lead agency in enforcing compliance with the law. The point that I have made repeatedly publicly ahead of this interim report, and that is also reflected in this report, is that ASIC needs to be stronger in their approach, that they do need to pursue litigation, impose the penalties that are available to them, rather than some of these negotiated settlements which have seen the perpetrators of these offences or misconduct get off too lightly.
Doesn't it show that you didn't have a tough cop on the beat? Historically, that cop that you described as the tough cop on the beat, it shows that they weren't a tough cop at that time.
I think what it shows is that they need to be tougher.
Well, the laws, what are the learnings of the government, never mind the regulator? Are there any criticisms in this that can be sheeted home to the government?
Look, the two key takeouts for me let's also make clear that this is a 1,000-page report. It's a 1,000-page report. Or nearly 1,000 pages. It's 3 volumes, and I want to commend the Commissioner and his team on the thoroughness of this report. But what is clear for me are 2 takeouts. One is the greed that has permeated the culture, the conduct and the compliance of the sector, and secondly, that the misconduct has gone to a large degree unpunished and effectively unpunished.
The reason constant human nature, the issue is why it was allowed to flourish, isn't it?
The question that needs to be asked is how did this culture of greed and selling as the dominant focus, how was that allowed to permeate the sector to produce adverse outcomes for consumers without being stamped out earlier and without the penalties that exist to be properly enforced? Sorry.
Do you think there should be criminal action though for the institutions that Commissioner Haynes found broke the law?
Well, the first thing to say, it's not for me or indeed anybody to prejudge the outcomes of the Commissioner's final report. This report does not include specific recommendations, nor does it include specific referrals, as far as we can see, in the 1,000 pages to the appropriate agencies. But obviously, any such findings or decisions by the Commissioner, if they are to be included, would be included in his final report.
Are there grounds for restructuring ASIC so that prosecution and litigation get a higher priority and there's not, they're not sort of subject to second guessing by a commissioner who's, maybe worried about or a chairman who's worried about the overall legacy and so on?
Well, Ben, as I referred to earlier, Daniel Crennan QC has been appointed the deputy, effectively in charge of that compliance and enforcement role, and he will make a real difference, I think, at ASIC going forward.
Are you surprised by the findings? Are you surprised?
Look, I am not surprised given what we had heard through the public hearings to date. Can I just say, the behaviour that we've seen to date has been unacceptable. Fees charged to dead people, fees for no service, 300,000 plus breaches for providing insurance advice that was unsolicited and was against the rules. Many other examples of conduct which is unacceptable. But now that it has been revealed, now that we have the interim report and next year the final report, it's incumbent upon those in the financial services sector and those regulators who are charged with enforcing the law lift their game because the public deserve it and the public expect it.
And why release this report on a Friday? It's a public holiday here in Victoria. We've got 2 footy finals weekends. Such an important report.
Well,
why are you releasing it today? Isn't there a better day to release it?
If we had sat on this report, because it was handed to the Governor-General today, if we had sat on this report, you would have said, what are you hiding? So from a government's perspective, as the Prime Minister indicated earlier this week, we received this report, or the Governor-General received this report this morning. We've made it public and now it's there for everyone to see. This issue is of vital community interest. There's a great deal of interest in this report. We're making it available so that people can look at it closely. And the other key point here is that the Commissioner has made clear he welcomes public submissions going forward. He's already received over 8,000 submissions. And judging by his report, it looks like the Commissioner has read all of them. And he's gone to a great deal of effort to ensure that people are properly heard and that the right case studies are pursued. And it's fair to say that those in the financial services sector are being held to account. There's been some pretty gruelling public hearings.
Last question.
I'll take the last two.
After everything you said about unacceptable behaviour,
Yes.
about how the utmost importance of this work, isn't there an explanation owed to the people of Australia about why the government resisted this commission for so long and resisted so hard?
Well, we are the ones who actually got the Royal Commission up and running. We're the ones who added aspects of superannuation and insurance to the terms of reference, and we're the ones who are implementing important reforms. We're the ones who have put in place the Banking Executive Accountability Regime from July. We're the ones who have added the extra financing to ASIC. We're the ones who have put their Daniel Crennan QC to be an effective enforcer of the law. We are the ones who put in place the Financial Complaints Authority. So we are taking action. We've called this Royal Commission, as I think all my colleagues have made very clear. This is important work that is being undertaken. The Commissioner has done an outstanding job and we await his final report. Last question.
Have you had any discussions with the Commissioner about either expanding his terms of reference or extending its deadline for the final report?
James, I haven't, but what the Prime Minister and I have made clear is that should the Royal Commissioner ask for an extension of time, then that will be granted. Thanks very much.
Treasurer Josh Frydenberg there saying that the interim